to the January 15th, 2025 City Council work session. Thank you all for joining us in this virtual format. Great to see you here today. For work sessions like this one, where there's no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling in to one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcasts and meeting materials webpage, the City of Eugene website. Thank you all again for joining us, and to counselors and community, thank you all for welcoming me into this role. With that, I will call the January 15th, 2025 City Council work session to order and turn it over to the City Manager to introduce our first topic.
Thank you so much, Mayor and Council. Super good to be back. Welcome to you, and welcome to new counselors and all those that are newly sworn in. This isn't actually our ideal way to start. It's kind of a big topic for the first meeting of the year and for a new team. But that's kind of where we're at. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. I'll continue to make some introductory comments along the way here. All right. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, two things were, I mentioned the timeline's not perfect, but there are timelines we're trying to meet. And as I've shared with staff inside the organization, they're trying to understand, like, what are all the things that are happening. Council could have a priority setting workshop at any time of the calendar year. You could do it in the middle of the biennium. You could do it anytime. It's just happening that it's happening now at the exact same time we're trying to finalize our budget to be able to get that into the system. And we can talk more about that later, but I think the pressure and urgency of getting the budget done makes this conversation a little bit more challenging and makes it feel more compressed than would ideally be. And also, before I get into it, I want to say, I know there's a lot of city staff that are paying attention to this and a lot of community groups that are nervous. And I hold their nervousness and respect as we start talking about prioritization, what that could mean for folks. And just know that kind of hangs over me and over this conversation. All right. I've pushed the advance button. It doesn't want to go. So what we're going to do today is generally we're going to walk through a couple of things, and we're going to have some decision points along the way. So the first thing that we're going to do is talk about the context of this conversation. It's really hard to jump right into a prioritization discussion, especially with new members, new counselor. And we know new people are tuning in. So as difficult as that may be to listen to a couple of the same slides again, we are going to go over a little bit of context, how we got here. And then, as you noted in the AIS, there's two kind of decision points or direction points that I feel I need in order to continue going. And the first one is really around, I'm calling it D1 because I didn't want to call it decision or direct. It's just kind of like where we're at, is around kind of what is the total lump sum of the gap that you want me to solve for. And we talked about that a little bit in December, but I'd like to get a little bit more specific today. And then we'll shift the conversation to how you might want to proportion that across services or departments. And then after that, we will come back. And so the plan currently is to come back on the 22nd with more specifics related to program areas and what might specifically be in a reduction. And all of that will get built into the budget. That's sort of an ideal scenario. And I just want to say, this really is in your hands. And I'm going to start with that. I'm going to end with that at any point along the way, you can send me and send us in a different direction. So I'm going to try to keep it sort of in this framework, but I understand that you may want to go in a different way. I will also say this set of meetings that we're going to have starting today is actually held in the context of a lot of different meetings that start way back with actually before the adoption of the biennial budget, but for sure when we adopted the biennial budget 2 years ago, there were specific things in there around addressing revenue, specific plugs that brought us to this place of having revenue advisors meetings, revenue recommendations, your first set of revenue increases that happened during the budget process, the stormwater fee increase, and then when paused at the fire fee. But it's held in the context of all of that. And I know even as we move forward, there'll be more to come. Even if you decide today, like, hey, here's where we want to go and here's what we want to reduce. I just want to always remember that we are continuing to innovate and evolve and work on our efficiencies and services every year. And so something that we may do today, we may not do tomorrow. So this is an ongoing theme of service improvements. In terms of the big history, there's really just 5 slides that I think are really important to highlight. The first one is just really highlight the problem we're all trying to solve. And this one, I think, captured it the best because it really talks about, our 3 biggest, but our 2 really largest revenue sources are property taxes and the contribution in lieu of taxes that we get from EWEB. And as you know, we have no real sort of control over either one of those. We don't set those. It's not like another business where we set those prices. Those are set for us. We do have some control over service charges. You made a lot of adjustments to that as part of the biennial budget, and you continue to do that. But it's really that big revenue source and the fact that our property taxes have a cap that you can see, over time, and these numbers don't change that much over time. Our growth is under 3%, and our revenues are under 3%, and our growth and costs actually are closer to 5 or around there, which isn't huge, but it creates that space and that gap. Just look at that. The other one that I think, is really important is just to understand that we've been doing this over time. So at least since the recession, over the last, all of these years, we've cut, $67 million out of the budget, and that doesn't include a lot of the things that we're doing internally. So even on those years that you don't see an arrow pointing down, those are years that we still did some internal measures, like we may have frozen spending, held vacancies. We did administrative things to save money, preparing for the next set of years. So there hasn't been a year where we haven't been in that space, and that when you get to this place where you're thinking about another $10 million, $11 million, every $1 million actually is into services. And as you know this, because as part of the biennial budget, you added back funding through the payroll tax for fire engine, and you added back with some one-time dollars funding for the Human Services Commission and for animal services, things like that. So those are real tangible things that when you start pulling $1 million off, you'll feel that. And this is how that sort of plays out across our employees. And again, we're just talking about the general fund, but if you look at how many general fund employees we have per 1,000, so 1,000 of population, it has been steadily dropping year over year. And actually, if you go back into the 80s, it was even higher. So if you do the math on that and you look at like the population of 1988 and the population of today, if we still had that same proportion in growth, we'd have about 230 additional employees in the general fund. Now, I want to be really clear. Some of those employees we have moved into other funds. So some of our parks general funded people are now stormwater funded people. So it's not like all of those employees have gone away. It's just what the general fund has the capacity to do. And then the last of the context slides that you've seen before was really this, feedback that I got when I was from you and from the community when we started talking about, in particular, both the stormwater and fire services fee. And that was really, you can do one or the other. You can either, reduce your programs or you can increase revenue. And people really fall in, there's some people that fall in lots of different areas, but the negative feedback tended to be, you have plenty of money if you would just prioritize it. You shouldn't be doing this service. You should only be doing this service. Or we have different ideas about how to raise revenue. We don't like this specific one. And so that whole idea of, just prioritize is how we are here today. And so before we jump into prioritization, I do want to talk about how we do that now. So currently, we have the city's operating budget is just under $1 billion in the biennium. So it's a pretty big budget for an organization. We have 35 different operating funds. So we're talking about the general fund, but there's lots of different funds. All of those have sort of a team of teams that are analyzing, monitoring, forecasting, looking at variables. Like we're watching the market, and we're continuously feeding information into our system to understand what's coming. And one of those that, the biggest piece is probably the forecast, because, we're looking out those 6 years trying to understand and making sure that we are making good business decisions to get us there and to have reserves so we can weather things like COVID when they come. There's a lot of things we look at with a forecast, but if you haven't been to a lot of budget meetings, you don't have all the details, but these are sort of the big ones. We're getting data in from other places. We're not making it up. We're getting, very specific data from eWeb, very specific data from Lane County and from the state. So that those numbers tend to be what we're forecasting. All of that information and all of that information gets built into our system, and that sort of becomes what we call the baseline. And that baseline is essentially where the exec team starts. So we start with we know whether we're going to have a surplus or a deficit. I think there's been maybe one year in my career where we had a surplus. All the rest have been deficit years, but we start with that baseline. And then we also take information from departments and teams. Every one of our department heads is out in the community. They're understanding what the issues are. They're understanding what's happening in their industry, their best practices. All of that information, I would call, feeds into our discussion. And then sort of like if you were a landscape architect doing site analysis, we do a sort of a priority analysis, which is, looking at our council vision and goals, all of the adopted plans, not just the strategic plan, but of the other adopted plans. Newly in the last several years, the community survey, our financial policies, all of these things weigh into our decision making. And layered over the top of that is really our team values. And we adopt those, and we've had them every year that we've gone through this process around how we want to approach this. And I've shown this graphic before, especially during the biennial budget. We've tended to, when we do this, we tend to come forward with an all-in approach, which is all of us have all this information, we've got your priorities, and I try to bring a budget to you that best represents a way you can get all of this done with whatever resources you have. That's tend to be how we do it. That turns into sort of our set of team strategies, and those team strategies gets taken by that team of teams with all that great finance knowledge, and they build that into a proposed budget, and that takes a lot of time. So that's why when we're talking about we're still in this strategy mode, all of that has to get built into our system so we can publish a document, can have our budget meeting in May, and get to our adoption. As you know, the budget committee, which is you and your 8 appointed community members, get the first run of that. You get public hearing, you get public information, usually public testimony at most of the meetings. You hold a public hearing, and that actually becomes more refined and becomes sort of your adopted budget. This last adopted budget, when we talk about priorities, accomplished what I would say there were sort of 3 significant things in it. The first one was if you include this and then the supplemental that we came back with, there's over $20 million of reductions that are in that budget. That's pretty huge for our organization. Importantly, a lot of those were ongoing, but even more importantly, some of those were one time, and those are the ones that are like right here that are going to be against our priority discussion because we have to now have a solution as we build the second budget. The second piece is the reallocation, where we took existing programs and we reallocated dollars. So we may have reduced a program over here, like took 2 vacancies, took that money and we put it over here. And the 3 areas we did were really taking an incident command response to downtown safety and cleanliness and really ramping up our resources there, developing a public spaces team and bringing on an incident commander to run all of that. And then the alternative response work that we shifted that contract from police into fire, and added a position to really step that work up because we knew that our community was wanting that. These were what we called the urgent needs investments that needed to happen. So even while we were making cuts, we were making investments. And then the third piece, which is a lot of why we're here, was an $8.3 million revenue plug that said, we don't want to keep going, and we are committed to finding a revenue source to fill that gap. And this will be my last slide, and then I'll turn it over to Twyla. But I think the piece that's also important to remember is we've been doing service improvement, process improvement on our budget over the last several years. We started off with a very incremental annual, what I would call somewhat reactive budget process, to shifting to a program-based budget. It's the company that we were working for is actually called priority-based budgeting. But it does it through programs. And so really until you set the priorities, I'm going to continue to call it a program-based budget. But that's why we have the materials that we have and that you had in your packet that really allow us to understand even across departments where we're spending money in specific programs, and people really understand what they're getting with their dollars. We shifted to a biennium to give us a little bit more flexibility, free up some resources, and have a little bit of a longer range look. And we started doing a really different type of long range financial planning, which we were hoping to bring back to you at the first of this year. And we're in this kind of work instead, but that's still work that's happening inside the organization. We also funded some, I would call them audits, kind of deeper dives into specific things. One was the alternative response work, which is what drove that investment I just talked about. We took a look, we're not done with the fire governance conversation by any stretch, but as part of that, we took a deep dive into the finances of the department and how things were moving between the two cities to just understand what we were doing with those dollars. And two things that are happening right now. We're taking a look at our core business services. So we have a consultant working on both that and our library, recreation, and cultural services programs to understand how do we benchmark across the rest of the country? Are there improvements? And just trying to understand how we do things and are there improvements to do them better? So that's sort of the context that this conversation starts with. And I'm going to introduce our Chief Financial Officer, Twyla Miller, who's going to lead the next portion of this discussion, which is getting into your first decision point of allocation. Not allocation, sorry, amount.
Thank you, City Manager. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Twyla Miller, your Chief Financial Officer. And in your agenda item summary, there was a lot of good information that supports some of the themes that Sarah was talking about. So one of the first pieces was the Revenue Advisor Memo. It was in attachment B, which is on page 20 of your AIS. And this was in response, that memo was a compilation of responses to questions by that team. However, this portion of the memo really details over the last 5 years the budget strategies that we've implemented in the general fund, because that's often a question of what have you been doing to address the gap over the years. So that's one piece of information in your packet. A second is our financial policies. So these begin on page 28 of the AIS. Our financial policies are a management tool. They help guide our organization, and they're actually recognized by Moody's, which is our credit rating agency, as a key piece of our financial management structure. The policies are overarching and focus on the following areas: resource planning and allocation, accounting and financial practices, revenues, capital improvements, organizational policies, and debt issuance. And I'll talk a bit more about our financial policies in just a moment. And then finally, in attachment D to your packet, there's program inventory information. The city manager was talking as we've entered this 23-25 biennial budget. We have taken a program approach to our budget. This is a program view of services created to provide a programmatic view of what do we do as an organization. So programs are categorized as either a community program, which are services that we deliver to the community, or a governance program, which are services delivered within the organization to support our service delivery. There have been multiple rounds of program inventory development as staff have considered program structure. This really is an iterative process that will continue to be refined as we look to the future and implement budget to actual reporting and look at other ways to refine and communicate how we deliver service to the community. The program costs that are shown in the attachment are the result of a cost allocation process that was used in 23-25 adopted budget. This is where service costs were allocated to programs. The cost allocations are organized alphabetically by program. And when costing programs, there are some positions that may be allocated across programs, while other positions have a one-to-one relationship within a program. An example of this would be the budget development program. This captures the costs of budget development within central finance, but also captures costs from budget development work that occurs in departments. For this reason, there's not an exact tie between the program inventory costs and the budgeted costs within a work unit or department budget. Next slide, please. Oh, do we have a delay? There we go. So next, I'll talk a little bit about financial policy history. So this graphic shows the major touch points since our financial policies were initially established in 1983. As you can see, there have been various updates over time. In 2004, we had a comprehensive review. We had some targeted debt reviews in 2007, 2008, and then key policies were reviewed as we developed the FY14 budget in 2013. And while there's not been a comprehensive policy review in some time, in the last budget cycle, we did identify this as an area to incorporate in future budget planning and also as a key part of our long-range financial planning efforts. So a longer, more comprehensive review is anticipated as we come into the next cycle. And then there are many great financial policies. You know, sometimes we talk about some of them using one-time revenues for one-time expenditures and so on. But the area I'd like to draw your attention to today is really policy A4. This policy discusses service priorities as outlined on this slide. I won't read through them all here, but these were last updated in 1992. And you can see they go in priority order by service level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Starting with the public safety system, fixed assets, and so on. And so next we'll talk about the first question we have for you today, which is our general fund target. As we think about balancing the budget for the 25-27 biennium, we're looking for direction on which problem to solve for. So as we brought to you in December, the current general fund target is $9.8 million. This is an annual figure. This contains the structural gap as part of the general fund forecast in fall of 2024. And as the city manager presented in December, there are several pieces we've added as part of the base gap that can be part of your consideration. The first is EPD vacancy. So in the 23-25 budget, due to the ongoing vacancies in the police department, we did institute an ongoing annual vacancy reduction to the police baseline of $1 million. Since then, the chief has been successful in hiring and is becoming closer to being more fully staffed. So as we recognize they may need this funding in the next biennium, we would propose as part of the base gap to include $1 million annually for EPD as they become more fully staffed. The second piece is the PDD mandate. This is $500,000 related to state mandated planning work. Over the past few years, the planning department has used limited duration staff to do this work, but this is an ongoing commitment. And so we would propose in the base gap, including $500,000 annually to address this work. For both of these, the EPD vacancy and the PDD mandate amounts, we would, city manager talked about proposing putting them in sort of a lockbox where they would only access the funds each cycle if they needed them. So if the police department were fully staffed and they needed to use these funds to address their budget, we would release those funds. And the same with the state mandated work in planning, as there can be some cyclical cycles to that work. The other two pieces with the general fund target were the transfers. So as you may recall, a priority of marginal beginning working capital in our annual budget were these two transfers. The facility transfer of $900,000 to support our capital needs in our general fund programs, and then also the Affordable Housing Trust Fund transfer of $500,000 a year. Because we're in a biennial budget and these have been a priority through our financial policies and council action, the base gap, as shown here, would include both of those transfers on an ongoing basis. And then the other amount that was in your packet and that we also talked to you about last month was the three items you see here that were funded previously at one time, but have been priorities over time that could be also included as an ongoing in the base gap, which would raise the target amount to 11.5%. The first is the Human Services Commission transfer. So the HSC transfer was on a one-time basis in the biennium and is not in the ongoing forecast. This would include that as an ongoing item. There were 4 neighborhood service officers in our 23-25 budget that were limited duration positions. This action, by including them here, would include those as an ongoing amount. And then finally, animal services. Last budget cycle with the 23-25 budget, there was a budget reduction for animal services of $200,000 that was added back as on a one-time basis. And so if that one-time amount was added on an ongoing basis, those 3 items would bring our budget target that we would be solving for to $11.5 million. And then in your packet, as the city manager mentioned before, we're looking for direction on 2 items today, and this would be the first. One is what is the target amount the organization should be solving for, and then also of these one-time pieces, are these the pieces that would be included? If there were alternate direction, that would be helpful to know as well. And I'll see if the city manager has anything to add before we open it up for conversation.
Yeah, so it would be helpful to understand. I think we got head nods in December, like, yeah, we kind of want to see what it would be to do 11.5. But I just wanted to double confirm that. One of the things that I think is going to be interesting and a little bit messy with this conversation, which is why I said these iterations keep going, is if we end up with an $11.5 million gap that we have to fill. So you've taken the 9.8 and you've added these 3 things in. It's possible that one of these 3 things will end up on that possible cut list, right? So you're adding it back for planning services, and we may identify it as a program cut as part of the solution problem. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing. But, for example, if you take 38% of the general fund in police, and they need to make a giant reduction, it's possible animal services are going to be right back up on the table, if you understand that. With that, I'll turn it over to the mayor and to all of you to begin this conversation.
Thank you, city manager and staff, for that discussion. Very helpful, both the context and the details that you all shared. I will now open up the floor for council discussion, and I see that we have one hand up already. I also just want to note that given the direction that we've been asked, the council has been asked to give to staff today, we have time for the discussion. If we get to 1:15 or so, I will try to nudge us into motions if we haven't already. I don't think that we'll need that amount of time before we get to the motions and discussion, but I just want to flag that for you all as we're heading into this portion of our meeting. So Councillor Clark, I see your hand up. I want to be sure I can see everyone.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate that. And I appreciate the first chance to say that to you. First and foremost, I just want to talk about scheduling and timing of multiple rounds of this. City Manager, you mentioned coming back a week from now, and I just want to say I know at least one of our members will not be here a week from now. So I'm hopeful that my colleagues would join me in wanting the full community and all of its members represented when we're talking about major priority setting. And so I would not want us to make decisions while one of our members was not able to attend. And I hope there's broad agreement for that. Secondly, I would say I hope that we approach this as the community expects us to, by virtue of the community surveys that we've done that talk about what our community priorities are from their perspective. And the way I read that anyway, from their perspective, it looks like let's stabilize core services first and talk about what core services are. And then to the degree we can, look at appropriate funding for other services that are outside of core service levels. So for me, for example, fire and police is number one, and I would not want to see them endure any cuts. I would not want to see across the board percentages cuts that would include them, where there are other services the city provides that are by no means as high a priority as fire and police are. Public works for me would be maintaining our assets would be a close second or third behind that. And from my perspective, everything else is on the table. I think that's the most responsible way for us to move forward and just admit that we can't afford to do all the things we'd like to do and solve all the problems we'd like to solve, but we have a responsibility, as Los Angeles is finding out right now, to focus on core services first and foremost before we talk about anything else. And so from my perspective, cuts to any other departments and some of the things mentioned there in the add backs are on the table. So that's my priorities personally. Thank you.
Councilor Ye.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I'll just agree with Mike that I really hope we can schedule these so that everyone's there as well. I think that's really important. I'm glad he brought that up. So I want to make sure I fully understand this. So my understanding is, should we decide to go with the $11.5 million number with all of these items still in it, that doesn't save these things. It just means that we aren't kicking them out at the beginning. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so they're still on the table. Should we decide, maybe we don't really we're looking at all the priorities and we're like, nope, this just doesn't make the cut. It's still fully on the table to be cut later. Okay, if that's the case, then I'm in favor of that method, mainly because I want to see things all together, right? And prioritize and judge them as a package rather than just looking at what are these 7 different things separated somehow as if they're less important than everything else or as if they're more important, either way. So that would be my preference. Not that I'm saying that these would be things I would keep or not, just that I want to see them all together. And just lastly, I really like the idea of putting the police and the PDD mandate items in kind of its separate little area where it's not guaranteed we're going to use these things. You don't get to just dip in and use them for whatever. They're saved. I think that's really brilliant as well. Yeah, I think I covered everyone. Thank you so much.
Councilor Kaczynski.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I'm going to start with 2 quick clarifying questions. First, at this time, we're really just discussing that first question that was before us about, are we looking at the 11.5 million or the 9? Is that kind of the topic at the moment?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then the second question I had is just, Twyla, you mentioned this in the presentation, but just drawing it out for clarity. the numbers that we're talking about are annual numbers, not biennial numbers. And so when we see this in the budget, it's going to be double whatever those numbers are. Is that
That's
roughly
correct.
double? Okay, thank you. I think most of the rest of the comments I were going to make, Councillor Ye just made. And so rather than repeat them, I'll just say that I do agree that including looking at that full 11.5 million increases that transparency about these services that we kind of look at as one time, but we would feel it if they were cut. It would feel like a cut to an ongoing service if they went away. So I think including that is important so we have that transparency. Thanks.
Councillor Groves.
Thank you, Mayor, and welcome, Mayor, to your first formal meeting. And it's good to have you on board. I agree. I'd kind of like to look at the 11.5 million, but I'm also where Councillor Clark is. I know we're not to this point yet, but I am concerned with cuts to fire and police. You know, fire in particular that hasn't grown over the years, and it keeps trying to do more with less per capita. You know, and especially in light of what's going on in Los Angeles that has happened to the east of us and could happen here. We just have got to preserve those key foundational services. But I'm also seeing other things that aren't police and fire that are very important as well, including our neighborhood services officers and things like that. So I'm fine looking at this in its totality. I'm fine looking at the 11.5 number, but I'm just telegraphing ahead of time where my prioritization is going to be. I also believe in the asset preservation piece, and you know, whatever we do continue doing, we need to do it to the best, of course, of our ability. But I think the day has come where we can no longer try to be all things to all people and continually pick up services and responsibilities that really aren't city responsibilities, and be very judicious in what we select to continue funding. And I think the public wants to see us do that. I mean, they expect us to be able to make the hard decisions. They expect us to provide for their safety and security. You know, I bring it up, and I know people get tired of hearing it, but you know, again, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think it is a really good yardstick for measuring services and what we need to be focused on first. And then when we still have gaps, then that's when we go to the public and say, are you willing to fund these outside your base property taxes? Thank you.
Councillor Evans.
Thanks. Thanks, Mayor. I want to concur, and I won't take up a lot of time with, you know, doing the ditto agreements to what has already been said. But I will say this, that, you know, we have three potential motions in front of us right now. And my direction is more of going toward a more surgical series of cuts instead of doing something that, and excuse me for the poor metaphors, of taking a hatchet and just chopping things off in a sequestration manner. That does not, you know, do it for me. I think that we need to take each one of the services that we are discussing and really look deeply into prioritizing, as what Councillor Clark had talked about, core services, or what Councillor Groves has talked about in terms of foundational services for the city, police, fire, public works, and then looking at another tier of services in terms of cuts, but we stay with the priorities that we have outlined for what our purpose is as a city. And again, that's public safety, public works, and then planning and development. And then after that are the other pieces that we really need to look at. And there's going to be some things that we're going to make some decisions about that we really are going to have to say to the community, these are things that we cannot sustain over time right now because we don't have the revenues to be able to do that. So I'm going to push for the 11.5 million. And I'm also going to be pushing for us to be doing more surgical conversations about what we cut and how much we cut instead of just a blanket cut across the board and taking 5% from this or 5% from that or 10% from this or 15% from that. I think we really need to look at it in a more robust way.
Councillor Leach.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I think I am agreeing with many of my colleagues when the 11.5 million, it just makes sense to move forward to look at that as a whole. So I'm supportive of that. I agree with Councillor Evans, looking at this a little bit more strategically and surgically rather than percentage cuts across the board. That being said, I don't think any of us are the experts on all of the little details programmatically that we're able to reduce and keep services or not. So I think there's going to have to be a combination of being presented with how the cuts could be made and what could be made. And I want to reiterate a point I've made in the past, kind of in response to one of the previous comments, which is that any prevention level work that we do now, any dollar that we spend in prevention is going to save us many times more than that in the future. So if we are only going back to our very core level services for fire, police, we are across time going to be spending an incredibly larger amount of money addressing the problems that we are now ignoring. So even though if we're saying our core responsibilities are this, let's get back to that core. If we're reducing the prevention programs that we currently have, we will feel that in all of our programs across time. We will be spending a lot more money addressing those. And so for me, it's my prerogative to be able to keep as much of that intact as possible and really look at this as what can we do now. I'm not necessarily for this budget reduction strategy. I think it's a good exercise in what we are willing to give up. And so I'm interested in continuing this process and seeing what happens. So thank you all for all your work and this effort.
Councillor Keating.
Thank you, Mayor. This isn't exactly the most fun first meeting of the year, so I appreciate the way the information was presented and my colleagues' comments. I do have a couple questions, and for the sake of time, I will share that I echo sentiments or elements thereof of all the aforementioned comments that my colleagues have shared. I do have a question in regards to police or public safety. City Manager, animal services, and for that matter, code enforcement, are those budget items that fall under police?
The animal services is one of the police programs, and code enforcement is actually in planning and development, and it's a mix of funding sources. As you can see from that program list, very few of our things are just solely general funded. There's a lot of mix.
Okay. Councillor Clark kicked off the conversation, and I concur with quite a bit of what he said in regards to our shared priorities and values, our community's priorities and values. And I would make a strong argument that the dollars toward human services, ameliorating houselessness, investing in emergency shelter, investing in our service providers, our local service providers' ability to help provide mental health and behavioral health stabilization, the neighborhood service officers, 600,000, animal services, 200,000. That is a public safety. Those are public safety elements that, like I've heard others advocate for, I would be very disinterested in making any cuts to police or public safety or fire and EMS, our public works for that matter. I am more interested in the more strategic approach and looking at programs that have a significant budget impact that might not be in the municipality's best interest to either continue or in our wheelhouse or enumerated in our charter. I'm going to reference one in particular, but I want to be very clear in my commitment to our library. But that library and cultural services has a significant budget that I would like to more surgically look at. And if there are no represented members of our municipal workforce or programs that could be better lifted up by the nonprofit or for-profit community, I would be interested in exploring said options. Like my colleagues, I'm interested in bringing back the $11.5 million strategy so we can have that more holistic approach and the more strategic scalpel-like difficult conversations to be had. But I hope, I'm certainly picking up what my colleagues are putting down and plan to advance a motion around the 11.5, but I hope my observations and my direction as one of 8 is understood this afternoon.
Councillor Clark.
Forgive me, I think Councillor Zelinka hasn't had a first round, and
I'm so sorry. Yes,
here.
please. Councillor Zelinka first, and then
Thank
Councillor
you.
Clark will be back to you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I too am in favor of the 11.5 million scenario. I think the slides that the city manager showed about where we are with regard to the budget, where we've been, is really important. The lowest FTE per capita, lowest expenditure general fund per capita in 20 years, massive cuts of $67 million over the last decade or so. What that means is all that the fat that people consider in the government is gone in the general fund anyway. And if we make further cuts, it's not elimination of fat and unnecessary things. It's elimination of whole scale services and city services that the city provides. So it's elimination. And so obviously police and fire are important, but all of the city services we do are important. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing them. And you may not agree with that. And especially if you don't use them, you tend to not think they're important, but other people do. So we live in a larger city. I think another name for the priority-based budget is cut the library, cut parks, cut recreation, cut public works planning, cut animal services, cut human services. Library will be over $4 million. Parks and recreation will be a cut of almost $5 million. Planning and public works and over $2.5 million, plus animal services and human services being cut. So that's not really a place that I want to go. And I really don't want us to be in a city that doesn't have those kinds of robust services or poor parks, recreation, and library services. I agree that we should take a strategic look and pick things. I think that's going to be a tedious and cumbersome and very unsettling process for the community and especially for staff. It's going to create a lot of organizational turmoil that I think in the end, if we're going to pass a fire fee, would be a disservice to it. My preferred alternative to this is to pass the fire fee, but also realizing that fire in particular, police got a lot from the CSI increase, but fire in particular needs new things. And I think a bond for new fire stations and new equipment is something that we should put on the table and have that fee paid for out of the fire fee. So that's my preferred alternative at this point, as opposed to making these really what I think are going to be unfortunate cuts in libraries, $4 million, parks and recs, $5 million, and human services and animal services. If we do.
Thank you, Councillor. City Manager, are you responding to Councillor Zelinka or hopping in the queue?
I'd like to make a comment before you break into your motion conversation. That's all.
Okay,
I'm
great.
writing down little bitty notes and there's things I can address for everybody.
Perfect. Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add some context comments to what the manager mentioned and that Twyla mentioned. I also agree with Councillor Zelenka that it's an unfortunate reality that we don't want to live in a city without all of the services that he mentioned in library and recreation and cultural services. Those are important parts of the livability of our community, and I agree with him. But at the same time, I don't think they're as important as whether or not somebody's house burns down. So, and keeping that from happening. And that's the reality that we're talking about. I think the other piece of context we need to look at, and I'm not going to make any friends of my constituents when I make this comment, but it's the truth. 20 years ago, we had a library on 13th and Charlton. Now we have a much bigger, beautiful building that needs to be staffed, and we have branch libraries. And the difference in the growth in that budget over time has been a piece that I think we need to look at too, is the programs that have grown over time relative to those core services that really have not. And that's one of the reasons why I would advocate for holding harmless to the degree we can core service programs, as opposed to other choices that we'll have to make, as Councillor Evans said, more strategically and more surgically. So thank you.
Councillor Evans.
Thanks, Mayor. And just to follow up on what Councillor Clark has just alluded to in his comments, one of the things that changes the calculus right now is what has happened in Los Angeles. And what is emerging from that particular disaster is, you know, the last thing that we want to have happen is for us to make a major cut and fire and then have a major fire happen. And we don't have the foundational infrastructure in place to respond to a major disaster. And we have talked about this before, more particularly about what happens when the big earthquake comes. We had a preview of that on the coast late last year. Thank God it didn't hit us. We had a preview of a big fire with the Holiday Farm fire in 2020, and my son and daughter-in-law got married in 2021 when they were supposed to get married in 2020 at the Holiday Farm. And that whole thing up to McKenzie was a complete and utter disaster. And so, you know, if that had happened in Eugene or happened in Springfield, in the metro area, we probably would be having a very different discussion right now. And so for us to be, you know, planful in this context, I want to make sure that we are investing in maintaining the key core element infrastructure that we have, and to growing that infrastructure even as we go through these proposed cuts. Because if we don't have the infrastructure in place, we can kiss this goodbye. And if we have a major disaster, a fire, a storm, an earthquake, whatever the case may be, we will be in deep doggy doo. I hate to get technical about it, if we are not properly prepared to respond.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Groves.
Thank you, Mayor. And to start with what Councillor Evans just said, you know, if you look at a major earthquake, fire already had its USAR team, Urban Search and Rescue Team, cut from the budget a number of years ago, already operating from deficits. And everything he said is absolutely true. I also want to agree with Councillor Clark about going through and looking at these core services, but I also agree with Councillor Zelenka. I don't want to see any of these services go away, and I'm not necessarily proposing that. What I'm proposing is how we fund the services that we're looking at. You know, I think the general fund needs to basically build us a stripped down model of a vehicle. And if we want the extra nice to have self-actualization pieces of the budget, then that's when we go back to the public, but we let the public have the say. We put together a levy and saying, okay, your general fund is going to provide these services at this level. If you want to add back in some of these other things that really truly make our community great to live in, it's going to cost this much extra. And this is why we are in this situation. I don't even think when I talk to people, I'm not even hearing them understand how we are in the financial hole that we are in, like other Oregon communities. And it's a state taxation problem is a big piece of this. Now, that doesn't mean we can't sharpen our pencil in a few areas, but I say we start with funding our foundational services first. And I use foundational as a term to tie into my Maslow model. And also because every time you say core service, everybody says they're a core service. Every time you say they're an essential service, everybody says they're an essential service. And the reality is we have to be able to speak candidly and honestly about where we are, what our realities are, but what we need to survive as a community. Then we can have that discussion about how do we fund those things that make us thrive as a community. And that's where we come in and talk about possibly floating a levy. So anyway, to augment the operational costs. That's where I am on this thing. I don't like being in this position. This isn't anything that anybody here caused, but it's just the reality of where we are as a community and as a state. But I also think we need to come at this in a real cogent manner that makes sure we fund those essential pieces, those foundational pieces, first out of the general fund, and then find alternatives for how we fund the rest of it. Thank you.
Councilor Krasinski.
At some point I'm going to want to jump in because they're going to keep going and going and going. And some of what I have to say might help clarify. So I'm happy
Manager, please right now is a
okay.
great time.
So there's sort of like 5 things that have come up. And one of the reasons we have set this up to be 2 decision points is we knew that the prioritization and percentage piece was going to be a more challenging conversation. And it sounds to me like you might have your agreement around what the number is. And so you could just make that motion and be done with the number and we could move on to the percentage conversation. With that, we provided the percentage as a starting point because you wanted to talk about priorities, and that's sort of the only way to kind of start the conversation. It isn't how we've ever solved any budgets in the past. We've never done it across the board. We've always done it as an all-in method. Couple quick things. One thing I just want to clarify, there's a very small amount. Public Works is the very smallest piece of the general fund. There's a very little amount of parks that are in there. So when you're talking about saving Public Works, part of the reason you're not having that conversation is most of it is funded separately. It's more of a utility model, similar to where we were trying to go with a fire fee of a utility model. So that's, losing your infrastructure and streets is not on the table with this conversation. And when you start talking about saving, this is where the percentage problem gets to be an issue. When you start saying, I don't want to take any cuts to police or any cuts to fire, you're holding a department and all of its programs above any other department and programs. And you may not feel that way. You may say, you know what, the alt response work is not as important to me as having the downtown library or whatever the thing is. So that's the next conversation where we start to get into that. And I would just say, if 2 last things, sorry. If the council is not interested in moving forward with a fee, like, hey, we don't want to do any new revenue, we just want to make the cuts, we would take that 11.5 and we will present a budget. The purpose of going into the programmatic pieces was understanding some of what you said around, we might do a fee, but we want to know what it is before we do the fee. And so that's what's causing this slight tension. The last piece is there's not enough capacity to float a levy to pay for this. There's, I think, total for the entire county, there's maybe $5 million left in the cap max. So if anyone else does it, that's the total available that I'm aware of. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for that context, City Manager. We have 4 hands still up in the queue, and I think we're going to move into these motions unless there's any other discussion beyond. So, Councilor Kaczynski.
Thank you, Mayor. So 2 years ago, or a little less than 2 years ago, Council gave the City Manager direction via approving a budget that had an $8 million plus revenue TBD line item. And that instruction was, rather than cutting a bunch of things, go investigate potential new revenue. And that's what the City Manager did. And she's brought back a revenue option. Is it a perfect revenue option? No. Is there a perfect revenue option that exists in the world? No. And so when we think about what our next steps with this are, I'm all for, let's have robust discussion, but where we are now is that we're talking about there's not $11.5 million worth of general fund programs on that list that we got that are not going to be deeply missed by members of our community. And so if we start going in and saying, we're going to try and find that 11.5 million by cutting these programs that are valued by our community members and doing it at this juncture, what we're going to see is in May, when we're reviewing our budget, we're going to have dozens, more than that, people saying, my program that values to me, that serves me greatly, is being cut. And we're going to have no option to refund that. And we've done it in the years past. We've had priorities where we've come, and I say we because I was on budget committee for some of these items. And so even though this is my first meeting, I've been involved in some of these where we've had community members come to us and say, this thing is a priority, and we've been able to put that money back. And there's not going to be that option this time. And so my interest here is in following through with the revenue option. That was the direction that you all gave a year and a half ago, and really helping preserve those services that people in our community love. And we're going to have to be continuing this conversation. My impression is that the underlying problems with the state taxes and the way that our tax structure in the state is working means that this problem is not going to go away. We're not going to be making this set of cuts and then never having to look at this again. And so that's my interest. My interest is we have a way in front of us to preserve these services. Let's look at the way to preserve the services. Thank you.
I'm going to check in on one more piece of process because City Manager mentioned something a moment ago that could maybe help move us through our motions and into any additional discussion or any other information that the council needs. It sounds like the body is close or maybe at a decision in terms of direction on the first motion that's in your packet. City Manager, do you have more information? Yes. Is there more information we need for the second set?
Yes, we have a whole nother chunk of this to move into the percentage point and to talk about the program areas. So yes.
So Councilors Zelenka, Leach, Evans, and Clark, your hands are up right now, but if you would agree to pause our discussion at this point, knowing that our first question before the body is just the first motion about direction on the amount of potential budget reductions to have explored and brought back to council. If the body's in agreement, then Council President, if you agree, I'd like to move us to that discussion and motion.
And the queue stays. Right. And the queue stays.
And the queue stays. Yes, I'll pick you right up where we are.
Great. Thank you, Mayor. Move to direct City Manager to bring back $11.5 million in potential budget reduction strategies to address the general fund gap.
Second.
Thank you. Any additional comments? Discussion on the motion? I'd like us to vote. All in favor? Okay, I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Any opposed? And the motion is passed 8-0. Moving on to our second and third motions and discussion or presentation. City Manager, I'm going to hand it back to you briefly.
Great. We have a few more slides, so I'm going to turn it back over to Twyla. There's a lot of information in, but we're not going to stay on the slides very long.
Yes, so I'll go through these quickly this afternoon. So this is back to our program inventory. And as some of the conversation has shown, many of the departments have programs that are funded across multiple funds. So this chart is showing by department, the program inventory, the biennial program costs, the percent of those programs that are funded in each department, and cross-departmental programs by the general fund. And then this final column on the right that shows department general fund percentage, that is the proportional percentage of each department in relation to their portion of the general fund for the GAP strategy, which if we go to the next slide, this is what was shown in your packet. So we've shown you this number before. This is looking at the general fund percentage of each their operational percentage by department. And so as you've been looking and have chosen the $11.5 million reduction, if we were to go this route with just the proportional split, this would be the reductions by department. We'll go to the next slide. And so the next few slides we'll go through quickly. They're a different sort than the program inventory in your packet. We're showing them by department, so you can see the general fund programs by department. I won't go through them all, but we'll just quickly go through each department so you can see the kinds of programs in the departments and the general fund portion of those programs. So the first two are in central services. So all of the programs in central services, a wide variety of services provided primarily within the organization, but somewhat to externally. Oops, no, go ahead, City Manager. Next would be fire. So these are the fire general fund programs and the general fund portion. You can see they're primarily funded by the general fund. Here's library, recreation, and cultural services general fund programs. So these are the programs in that department and their portion of general fund funding. The next is planning and development. Police. And then public works. Public works also has many programs, but as the city manager mentioned before, and as you could see from the other percentages, their total general fund component is quite small. And then if we, keep going. So there's two more. So when the programs were created, there's programs that live primarily within departments, and there's also programs that are funded across the organization. So I gave the example earlier of budget development. There are many programs that are funded across the organization. So those cross-departmental programs have been pulled out, and this slide and the next show those programs that are provided across departments. So there's this one and one more. And so this makes up the programs. Again, there was a different sort of the programs in your agenda item summary. And then looping back again, you've just chosen the $11.5 million option for us to bring back information on the 11.5. As you think about approach, we do have, it's been brought up here today, a range. So there's programs and services reductions. There's also revenue options or some combination of the two. We know that that we'll need to address those as we look now and into the future. And then this is the current proportional split by department that we've just been talking about. And then there are motions to your right that were also in your packet. And I think with that.
Thank you, Twyla.
Sure.
As we talk about next steps, and I know that last slide that we just showed is making everybody really uncomfortable. So I get that. We're trying to come up with an approach that would work. We've shown this before around next steps. This is what we were anticipating in December would happen. As recall, we paused the fire discussion to have this conversation. knowing that we could potentially have some sort of a priority discussion, but we do really need to wrap up what's going to go in the budget. So I'm sort of riddling myself, like, how is this going to happen? Because as local government, we can't, I have to present a budget in May that balances. I can't just bring something forward that's unfinished. So I'm not exactly sure how to do that without just building those reductions in or revenue in. So that's what we showed you before, but this is sort of where we're at. I mean, this is really, it's in your hands. As you know, there's multiple directions that you could go with this, and we're here to support you and adapt as fast as we can to the issues that you're trying to address. I'm going to go back to this slide just as a starting place, and then I'll stop the share because this number is actually in your packet. I'm just going to let it sit there for those folks that don't have a packet. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, City Manager. Very important information for us to have. Picking right up where we were in the queue, Councilor Zelenka.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm a little surprised at you, Mike. What we're doing here is not going to cause anybody's house to burn down, nor is it going to prevent it. And that was a pretty surprising comment that you made. Responding to LA was caused by climate change induced drought over years and years, with an extreme weather wind event also caused by climate change, in my mind, that hasn't been seen in over 30 years. And a robust fire response was not going to prevent or save any of that. That stuff happened in hours, and it didn't matter what kind of fire response they threw at it. If you looked at the pictures, you realize that pretty clearly. We already missed our opportunity to prevent stuff like that by addressing climate change. We're just failing on that at that front as a world and as a country. And I think our best response and most appropriate response is to put out a fire bond for fire service equipment and stations, increase the fire funds through the fire fee, and use up that $5 million for a fire levy before someone else does. That's my preferred alternative moving forward. That does prioritize fire and makes it an important thing that we all believe it is, by funding it appropriately. On regard to the next part of this, I don't really want to go through an exercise of trying to figure out what percentage each one of these should be cut. That takes a deep knowledge and understanding of the complexities and interactions and interplay between all of these things that really only the city manager and his staff has. I think an alternative, we should just ask the city manager to come back with surgical cuts that eliminate services that the city provides. And I think if actually the first motion kind of already does that. It doesn't actually put the word surgical in there, but she has to come back to it. I'm going to be a no vote if we start going through percentages. I don't know how we're going to do that anyway.
Councilor Leach.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, City Manager and Twyla. I know this is incredibly difficult for all of us. I was wondering if we have an additional column in the packet than you kind of presented in these slides, which is cost recovery. Could you talk about what the cost recovery number means in terms of in the budget and what we're looking at?
Thank you, Councilor Leach. So the cost recovery was an estimate during program costing where there were charges or cost revenue that was brought in specifically related to those program areas. So for instance, in Lark, some of those programs might be program fees and other pieces. So each program manager went through and identified where there was a revenue that was brought into the city that was specifically related to that program area. So it's a range of things depending on the program.
Perfect. Thank you. I think that adds that additional complexity, like Councilor Zelenka was just saying, that we don't necessarily always have those pieces of exactly the revenue that's paired. So I'm going to use an example in this packet, the stormwater public outreach. In my mind, I might not necessarily think that $1.8 million for public outreach on our stormwater was some, I might think that I'd be willing to omit that from some of that from our budget, more so than other things. But our cost recovery it's saying over $2 million. So that program is paying for itself plus. So why would we cut something like that that's paying for itself? The next question I have is the general fund portion of that program it's saying $243,000. My question is, if that program is bringing in over $2 million and is costing 1.8 million, why are we still designating 243,000 from the general fund?
Staff would like to respond or in future?
I can't give an in-depth response now. I can tell you there's lots of places where we have to supplement some of our utility funds with general funds. Otherwise, just for it to be a legal use of it. And I can't tell you specifically on this one, but it's similar. Like you can only use road funds during certain stuff, and you can only use stormwater for certain stuff. So if you're doing that education more broadly, you have to include some other general funds. So that's what I would say off the top of my head. But yeah, you raise a good point about this is why it's all kind of stuck together and why we wouldn't typically, this takes a long time. Like if council had said, we're not interested in the revenue at all, just go make the cuts. We would be working on this as a team and bringing you a proposed budget. This is, again, I know I've already said this, but we're having this conversation because you said before we want to move forward with a fee, we want to know what the cuts are, and we want to prioritize, and that's a little bit of a different conversation.
Yeah, I agree, and I agree with Councilor Kaczynski as well that we asked for you to bring back revenue. You did so, and in a way that I agree with moving forward with. But I also agree that we all need to see where the cuts could potentially be. So in terms of moving forward with the next motion, I would say that just to proportionally bring us back proportionate cuts to the programs, because otherwise we're not going to be able to see line item by line item every single one of these programs when some of them are so complex, like this one that we just talked about just randomly, that some of them have revenue and some of them have like requirements that have to come out of general fund, and none of us are going to know every single specific thing about every line item, like you all are going to be able to designate. And so let's look at what those budget cuts feel like that are proportionally spread that 11.5 million across the programs. And then we can continue to have this conversation next time.
Thank you, Council. I'm keeping sense of the time we have and the motion decision that we still have ahead of us, and that we have 5 hands up. So if you would all agree, and we're heading into third rounds for everyone, if the councilors could keep these comments or this part of the discussion to 1 minute each, that will give us 6 or 7 minutes to get through our final action item and get everyone out of this meeting on time. So Councilor Evans, just 1 minute, please, if you would. Thank you.
3 things very quickly. One, I would like to see a proposal or what the proposal is in terms of how we are looking at the consolidation of service delivery. What are we doing about trying to save money and resources in terms of how we deliver services? That's one piece. The second piece is how close are we to landing ourselves with the proposed fire merger? That's one of the cost savings that we identified a long time ago. And this conversation has been going on for a long time. And I know that Councilor Clark and other councilors are have been after this for a while. But I want to know where we are on that. And then finally, I think not for this conversation or discussion, but at some point, we're going to have a broader discussion about our CIP budget and what we are doing with that.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Clark.
Thank you, Mayor. Item number one, for my colleagues in favor of moving forward with the fire fee, I would say that my greatest concern with that is that we're looking at a potential EWEB increase to the cost of electricity and the cost of water provision. That will be a significant addition with this enough to the community that I think we would face an election with someone getting sufficient petitions for reversing our decision if we decide to move forward with a new fee. I think that would take place and happen in the community. Number two, Councilor Zelenka, my comment was about if we go across the board cuts, which I won't vote in favor of, that would mean closing a fire station, and that will result in people's houses being at risk.
Thank you, Counselor. Counselor Groves.
Thank you, Mayor. And I have to respond to what Councilor Zelenka said earlier. No fire department's going to be able to start a fire from happening. Where a fire department makes its difference, whether it's a house fire or a conflagration, is marshaling resources to quickly engage the problem while it is still manageable. And that is the way it works. And there are problems with LA. They had a $19 million cut from their budget, and the state of California cut, I believe it's $100 million out of their fire mitigation fee that would have helped reduce some of the risks that they are now trying to battle on the line. So there's so much misinformation going on about that fire right now. I think it's really important that we understand our facts. I spent a 37-year career in the fire service. I'm pretty familiar with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Ye.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't personally think that it is the city manager's job to figure out what the prioritization of cuts to our budget is. That's not fair for us to say, you go figure it out for us because it's too hard. Like I know it's not easy, and it's none of us probably want to do it, but unfortunately that's the job that we asked for. So in the absence of that and having time to have that discussion to then vote on what our priorities would be to give to the city manager, it makes sense to maybe, in my mind, I'm thinking maybe we start with this proportional thing, which I'm not a super big fan of, but it gives us a starting place. It says, okay, this is what it would look like if we did this. Now, if we aren't okay with this, we shift it and it goes here. And then the city manager has something to work with. So I'm okay with starting with this proportional thing with the understanding is there are probably going to be shifts that get made along the way before we get to that final step.
Thank you, Counselor Zelenka.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Councilor Ye. I would just add a little bit to that. I think that is a sequential process that will take forever or take a very long time. Instead, I think maybe if we have the city manager come back with options, one would be the proportional cuts. One would be no cuts to police and fire. Another would be a more surgical approach that the city manager thinks is appropriate. Maybe those kind of three basic options moving forward, and then we can come back and look at what that means on a more specific basis. But again, and Randy, $19 million on the fire department budget for LA was like, come on, their fire budget's probably our city budget.
And Counselor Ye, yes, see you back in the queue.
Got to unmute. So I'd love to hear what the city manager thinks of that. I think bringing back 3 budgets is unrealistic. That would be a huge investment of time and staff resources, I assume. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Well, I mean, it certainly puts everybody in a little bit of disarray. That's not the right word, but I mean, the reality, I'm busy trying to think about like the reality of on July 1, if we don't have a revenue source in place, or we're close to having a revenue source in place, we're going to be necessarily laying people off. So it's that's kind of how that goes to balance it. There's not enough reserves to carry us through this. So we can bring back a list of program areas that are sort of like, here's the proportional and how that would play out. Here protects, and I would call it sort of, I know you're saying foundational and core and all those different things, but maybe the most from the chief's perspectives, most core elements of their police operations or patrol or fire operations. I don't know that just because something lives in one of their departments, that would be considered core to their service area. So that's the part where it gets a little more challenging for me.
And you could bring those two things back. We could discuss it, and we still have time should we want to do the fire fee and get it all done in time, you think?
It's a stretch, but if you're moving forward on it, I think there's some hope for that. And we're prepared. We've been working on this. So we're prepared to bring you back a set of options for 11.5 next week.
I could support that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Councilor Kaczynski.
And this is just a very quick clarifying question. What we're voting on today when we're talking about these proportional cuts are not, these are the cuts that will be made. This is the data that you're going to present to us next time for us to have further discussion about how you're going to build your budget, whether that's a specific set of cuts, whether that's new revenue, et cetera, correct?
Yeah, I'm still thinking through that. So for example, I'm going to try to think of something that's not super specific, because anytime I say something, everyone's like, oh my God, that's the thing. But let's say we do, it'll be the area. Like I would hesitate to say, we're going to impact this very specific program in this very specific location. If we have 5 of them, it might be one of them, and we might need some time to think through that so we can be really strategic. And we're really good at that, right? But yeah, what we would be bringing forward is what would be built into the budget. we're not going to play, like, this isn't we're trying to scare people into this. This will be what's in the budget.
I guess to clarify separately, what we're voting on today is not what's going to be on the budget. It's going to be what you bring back for further discussion.
Yeah, bring back next week.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you both. Councilor Keating.
Thanks, Mayor. I'm on my mobile device. For some reason, our internet went out here. So I've got a series of questions. I apologize if they're a little disjointed because I'm not on my laptop anymore. If council were to pass the fire service and budget stabilization fee, and we've indicated earlier this afternoon that there's an $11.5 million shortfall, or not shortfall, but $11.5 million across departments and services that we need to be addressed. And let's say that budget, that fire service fee generates 10 million for easy math. I think it's like 9 point something, whatever it is. And we just approved 11.5. Do we then, the direction we're giving the city manager, are we looking at the delta? City manager, would you come back with if it was a 10 and 11.5, would you come back with 1.5 in reductions?
Thank you, Councilor. What was going to happen with the 10 million? So if you pass the fire fee with the 8 million stabilization, 2 million new services, we were already going to, your proposed budget that I present in May would already account for the other cuts. We would figure that out. We would do that in our normal process. And that's what would happen here. If you determine you want to do that, that's what we'll do. We'll navigate that in a different way.
Okay, may I ask a clarifying question then? Let's say we allocated across the departments, just for sake of argument, 25% city services, 0% fire EMS, 25% recreation cultural services, 25% planning and development, 0% police, and 25% public works. With those 25% allocations coming to 100%, just look at 1.5 million or look at 11.5 million in reductions.
Well, right now the direction is 11.5. And if you allocate it 25%, there's not enough general fund and public works to pay for 25% of this reduction, I don't think. Maybe there is, but it would be more than, it'd be like 25% of the 11.5 million would be a huge portion of their budget. That's why it gets really challenging. So right now, what you've asked me to do is bring back $11.5 million worth of reductions. That's the direction. And so
Move
the
to
question
extend
is,
15 minutes.
Second.
Thank you. You jumped right ahead of me. Carry on, City Manager.
the question I think on the table now is, what kinds of programs do you want me to bring back next week? And if you say, hey, police is off the table, the entire department's off the table, then we won't bring police programs next week. If you say, bring me the, protect the core mission of police and fire while bringing me back $11.5 million of solutions, somewhat proportion, we'll do that. So it's a nuance, but I'm hearing that you want to see the programs next week. There's a question about whether you want them to be across the board or not. One recommendation was bring back 3 scenarios. One is the across the board that's in the packet. One is protecting those core services. And then the third is what's my surgical option? And that's basically that I probably wouldn't be able to get to between now and next week because we'll still be working on the others.
City Manager, Council, I want to just do a quick process check because we are at our time and 1 minute passed. We still have some motions to complete and one councillor with a hand raised. I heard a motion and then we didn't have a full group vote of the group in a second to add 15 minutes to our meeting now. Does that work for everyone? Motion, and there was a second, but I missed who it was in that.
I seconded it.
And you actually need to take a vote.
And all, okay, we're good. Carry on, Councillor Zelenka.
You actually have to take a vote if there's a motion.
Thank you. Please.
So
all in favor of adding 15 minutes to our meeting right now and conclude this meeting at 1:47, or sorry, yes, 1:47.
45.
Aye.
Thank you. And the motion passes. Councillor Zelenka, please continue.
So, yeah, it is a tall order to do that, City Manager. But I can't answer the questions you posed until I know what all those look like. That's the problem. It's a chicken and egg thing. You can't say, cut all this without knowing what we're talking about. That's irresponsible. So I think 1 week is just unrealistic to come back. And I would rather not come back with incomplete information. I still think options so we can know what we're talking about when we're discussing what potential budget cuts there are is the way to go. And I still think you can do the proportional cuts, no police and fire, and a more surgical one. And if it takes 2 or 3 more weeks than that to do that, I think that's appropriate. But I hate to go into the conversation just with those 2 options because that bothers me. I'd be a no vote.
Councillor Clark.
Thank you. I agree with Alan, and I move not to decide without a full complement of councillors at the table.
A full complement. Can you define that term for me? Will it be
all 8?
All 8.
So
I think that would have to be part of a motion, and we'll get there in a moment.
I just moved that, as a matter of fact. If there's a second, I'll
Second.
Well, what did you
vote on
move?
that. I don't need to speak to it. I think everybody understands it.
What did you move?
To not make a decision on prioritization without the full complement of councillors at the table.
So can I seek a clarification, please? Just because I think you're speaking to a specific date, but in fact, there are times when people are sick and so you don't have anyone. So I just am seeking clarity. If you do not have all 8 counselors at the table, regardless of reason and regardless of the date in which that lands, you're saying your motion is to not take a vote on that night.
I'm hoping that we're not going to decide next week while some of us are gone. That's really my solution. So if there's a better answer, I'm happy to adjust my motion, but I'm just trying to keep us from deciding next week when we know the full council will not be here.
Why don't you just defer to a date to be determined, not next week?
I feel like I got to jump in here because we're never going to get through this conversation. I'm not saying you have to make a decision next week, but if we can't talk about it and we just need to wait and wait, we will never, I'm going to build a budget with an $11.5 million set of cuts in it. I'll have to. So that's the part where
that's the direction we seem to be going. And I would suggest are in need of before we can make a final decision on the other anyway. And so I just was saying, I don't want to make a decision on priorities without all of us at the table.
Councilor Keating.
Thank you. I'm not the parliamentarian, but as council president, my observation would be that the motion is out of order. While I understand the intent and actually agree with the intent, the reason I would consider the motion to be out of order, Mayor, is that ensuring that we have a full complement then empowers any one of us 8, for whatever reason, whether we're ill or we decide not to show up, would then prevent the work of the body moving forward. As enumerated either in or in ORS and or in our charter, it outlines what a majority of council is to do our work. If we change that, we're fundamentally changing the description of council as outlined in our charter. So I recognize and understand the intent and would want a full complement of councilors to be available, but I don't think it's appropriate legally to change that.
Restate the motion to not decide next week.
All in favor?
Second.
So just so I'm clear, the motion on the table is to not make a decision on priorities next week. Does the second accept that new motion?
Yes.
Okay, so that is the motion on the table now.
So can I just clarify that we're still able to discuss it, even if you're not deciding? Okay, thanks.
Thank you, City Manager. Councilor Kaczynski, you have been waiting and you are our last discussion, hand raised. And then we're going to move to this motion.
So I don't think I'm supposed to talk about the other thing while there's a motion on the table. So I will speak to the motion on the table. If we are discussing this next time, but we are not able to make a decision, does that mean that there will be a third meeting scheduled where there will be space to make decisions? Because I'm worried about us. Councilor Clark made a comment about feeling like he knew the direction we were going in. And I would disagree with Councilor Clark's perception of the direction that we're going in. And so I want to make sure that there is a clear point where we are making a decision, as opposed to sort of a slippery, we all voice our opinions, but there's never a clear, this is the decision.
I think, I had an opportunity to talk to Councilor Groves earlier today about the possibility of moving some things around on the 27th or 29th to be able to accommodate so we could still meet our timeline. And I'm going to meet with staff right after this to figure out what happens if you don't decide. So, thanks.
Thank you. Moving out of that discussion, we have 2 motions outlined. We also have some other language, I think, proposed that tried to capture the discussion and the feedback from City Council today that is maybe a little more nuanced. We also have a proposal to ask for multiple budget options or multiple reduction scenarios to be presented back.
We'll have to vote on my motion.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Councilor Clark.
So there's a motion and a second on the table to not take action regarding priorities at the next meeting. So that should be voted on.
Council, can we take that vote? All in favor? one. Okay, we have seven in favor, and any opposed? And one opposed. Motion carries 7-1. Thank you, Councillor Clark, for helping us to close that loop. Moving to our last piece of this discussion then. Everything that I just said, we have two motions described, a proportional approach or an allocated by percentage approach. Council has offered feedback. I would like to hear from the city manager if there is a way we can capture in language some of what the body has requested today, knowing that we're going to be discussing this again. We're not taking action today. We are trying to gather more information and then move towards a date in the future, not next week when we do make a decision.
I think for next week, I'm just trying to think of I'm going to talk and Catherine's going to write it, I'm guessing. But it feels like for next week, since you're not making a decision, maybe a starting place would be directing me to bring back the 11.5, show it proportionally as it is now, and potential impacts if you protect core fire and police services.
Yeah. I could read what I think I just heard, if that's helpful to people.
Okay.
Please.
Move to direct the city manager to bring back two options for council discussion. One, allocating the 11.5 million across city departments and services based on current proportional share of the general fund of each department. And two, allocating the 11.5 million across city departments and service in a manner that preserves core public safety services.
Council discussion.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you.
That was out of order. There was a cue.
I'm so sorry. Trying to sort hands up versus motion discussion. Before we move to that motion, Councillors Link and Councillor Evans' hands are both raised.
Yeah, I believe I was first. I like the motion, except I would add a third option, which is the city manager targeted option at a later date, so that she works on that one, because I think once you see the proportional one and once you see the zero, and I assume that the whole core services thing that was oddly worded, I think, which is it'd be more simple. My understanding is that's zero cuts to fire and police. Is that what you're talking about? And so I would add a third option to that. That would have the city manager bring back a third option of more targeted cuts at a later date, other than next week.
Is that a friendly amendment?
So can I respond to your question about whether that was zero? What I heard Sarah, what I was attempting to capture was based on the conversation of what Sarah said, which was that preserves the core public safety services. So it didn't actually say zero cuts to the.
Well, Matt's core services included human services and animal services. And so I don't know what that means.
So that earlier I said I would defer to the chiefs for what they would call their core mission, most core to what they do. And it could be that things that are core to you will not fall in their core list. And if you say no cuts to police and fire at all, like those departments are held completely harmless, and Councillor Zelenka's third piece, which is essentially city manager, could you do your job? Bring us back a budget that makes sense, which is not where this whole thing started. There would be cuts in those departments after conversations with the chiefs around what would they protect, because it would be very difficult for me to get there without that.
So with the understanding that cuts to core services in preserving cuts to core services in fire and police only, and I would add and bring back at a later date a third option where the city manager has a more targeted budget list, and I move that as a motion.
Sorry, everyone, we've got to check in on the process here because you have
Mayor,
some.
Mayor, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mayor. I believe there's a motion on the table.
That was an out of order.
No, what was, Counselor, with all due respect, what was out of order is coming in on top of it and speaking to something that wasn't the motion that was seconded by Council Vice President.
If you weren't recognized to be on the floor, you can't make a motion.
So the goal of Robert's rules is to get the council as a whole where they're wanting to go. So knowing that to be true, what we have, I think we can accomplish, Councilor Zelenka, what you're seeking with a motion on the table. So if we have a motion on the table, then I think what I hear you saying is
Add a third.
You're adding a third option that would to bring back at a later date a surgical allocation of the 11.5 million as proposed by the city manager. If that is acceptable to the maker of the motion in the second, then that's the motion on the table.
Yes, it is.
Yes. And just to be clear, you can't shout out a motion when you don't have the floor and have it be a legitimate motion.
Well, I'm happy to have that larger conversation when we're not talking about the budget, about the protocol of our meetings when we're in a digital space, which is a difficult one. But as council president, I made the motion that I heard described by city attorney.
It was a gray area, Alan.
Thank you. Thank you both. We're going to find our way right through that gray area and to close this decision. Councilor Evans and Councilor Clark, are these clarifying questions that add to the motion that are friendly amendments?
No, my point here is a point of clarification so that people don't get confused out there about what we're talking about. We're talking about a total over the biennium of $23 million in cuts. That's 11.5 and 11.5, correct?
Correct. It's 11.5 ongoing.
So over the biennium is 23 million.
Right.
Okay, that I wanted to make sure that that was clear to people who are watching this meeting in the public space. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor. City Attorney, I'm going to ask you to read our motion one more time for clarity for everyone, for the body, but also for the public, and then for the council president, if he chooses to so move.
So I'm trying to do this in real time. So if it's mistaken, somebody needs to say something. And also I'll just clarify it. If I'm reciting it correctly, this is the motion on the table with a second that's ready for a vote. Move to direct the city manager to bring back options for council discussion. 1, allocating the 11.5 million across city departments and services based on current proportional share of the general fund of each department. 2, allocating the 11.5 million across city departments and services in a manner that preserves core public safety services, and bringing back a third option at a later date, allocating the 11.5 million in a surgical manner as proposed by the city manager. Is that capturing everybody's? Okay. So that is the motion and a second on the table.
Motion was by Council President Keating, was seconded by Councilor Groves. All in favor?
Wait a minute. I didn't agree to add the amendment, and I'm the seconder of the motion.
I'm sorry, please. Councilor Groves, respond.
No.
Okay. So
withdraw the motion and make it again.
So, Councilor Zelenka, if you just make a motion to add the third and bring back a third option, then that, if it passes, it becomes part of the main motion. It becomes part of
okay. Then I move to add that third option.
All in favor?
But there needs
Guys, for lack of a second.
No, second.
And now all in favor? See 2 opposed. 6. Motion does not pass. Motion failed. Back to our primary motion just read by the city attorney.
which is the 2 options.
I regret this.
All in favor? See 8 8 in favor, any opposed? 0. Thank you very much. Motion passes 8-0. Thank you all for working through that important conversation. We'll come back to it with more information in the future and a decision point, not next week. With that, that concludes our agenda, and I will close the January 15th, 2025 City Council work session. Thank you all.
Well done, Mayor.